Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie Council, welcoming back Rachel Ziemba, who is head of Ziemba Insights and an adjunct Senior Fellow of Energy Economics and Security at the Center for a New American Security. Rachel is going to help us understand why we can't quit Russia. And here we go. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to have you back after almost a year after you were here talking about our topic was the hidden global growth crisis. And at the time, events hadn't unfolded as they had. Russia had not yet reinvaded Ukraine. I say reinvaded. Everybody says invaded, reinvaded Ukraine.
With you on that.
Yeah, the Beijing Olympics hadn't happened. We were in a different world. We were still importing goods from Russia and China and looking to them to grow our stagnating economy and to fight inflation. And then the world blew apart. And so here we are a year later, and we thought we would have you to come help explain what is really happening. Has anything changed? And that thought has really gotten to me over the last couple of days with reporting coming out that, in fact, Russia's hard to quit. People are still trading with Russia. The world is still functioning. Yes, maybe we're doing more with renewables, but hey, everybody still loves oil. I was at a recent event, met two Norwegians, and they're like, hey, we love oil, buy more. Literally quoting verbatim. And I thought, wow, oh my gosh, nothing's changed. And I'm exaggerating for effect here, but can you work us through if anything has changed? And what, we talked a year ago about a global growth crisis. Is there really a global growth crisis? Either or, help us to understand what's
Yeah, no, so I guess I'll just first say thanks for having me back. It's always great to chat with you guys. I always enjoy listening to other guests. So I think certain trends, maybe things haven't changed, but yet from some other perspectives, a lot has changed in terms of, so Russia may still be getting the goods it needs, but it's getting it from very different countries. And that on the one hand, and that sets up other problems for the future. Now, I know, and that's something I think we'll probably talk about, but so if what has happened is, a lot of it, as I see, is that we sort of started the year, or sort of at the sort of start of the renewed invasion. And there was a lot of questions of, would the developed economies hang together? How would that sort of work? We talked about, and we were one of the few people talking about at the time, oh my God, like these are two really big agricultural producing countries, plus throw in Belarus as a fertilizer. And we were worried about what that looked like. But I think what we've seen, if anything, is maybe remarkable coordination among developed economies. The G7, the G10, however you want to construct them. And it's not just about Russia, we've seen, and the like, but we have seen more and more fractures between the global West and the global South. It maps out in different ways in different geographies. This is not only a function of Russia's war, it's also a function of US and Western relations with China. Where, yes, we haven't, sort of quit trade with China, but there's a lot more barriers in place in some of what are the most sensitive industries, right? And I'm sure we'll come back to and talk about export controls in due course. But so what I think Russia has been able to do is to reroute and find some, not only sell their products to different countries with, I would say, the support of the US and other and its allies, who are really worried about what the macro impact of a sudden stop of Russian oil would look like, but also has been able to source goods from other locations. Now, I would argue that whenever a country is subject to major sanctions and other restrictions and barter trade, they can't get the best products, and maybe they have to pay more for it. But at the end of the day, Russia is still getting the inputs it needs for its war machine. The other thing I do think that's changed is, beyond this sort of rerouting, is that Russia, if anything, has really centralized around not only the state and the military, and has really jettisoned what the sort of liberal internationalist hopes of its strategic economic interests. And I know, Nick, you and I over Twitter and other places, we've sort of had some of those conversations. But they have really focused on this strategic aim of this conflict, with the existential issues as they see it, to jettison opportunities in cleaner hydrogen, cleaner ammonia, and they've really sort of said, well, we maybe don't care about being a reliable supplier of energy writ large if our customers aren't reliable, right? So as we look at it, and the Russian growth challenge has been a long-term issue, first of demographics and then of lack of investment. And if anything, all those issues are even greater because the mobilization of the whole economy is tilted towards the war machine. So now that doesn't mean that they're going to turn around and the whole cost benefit analysis they look at is very different to how sort of a liberal internationalist might. And of course, I use those terms and I say, well, I don't think what we describe what the Biden administration, how they look at the world, isn't exactly liberal internationalist in quite the same way. Maybe from a political and human rights perspective, yes, but not from an economic policy free trade perspective. So I do think that some of these trends have been mutually reinforcing. Why don't I stop there? Because I want to hear what you guys have to say and see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, well, I'd love to stick with the rerouting because I think this is something that people don't quite understand, right? On a meta level, they're like, well, there's sanctions. We feel good about that. Right? We feel good that we put sanctions in place. We're sanctioning individuals. We are putting a price cap on the oil, but it's really not enough. And we've talked over this year too. Is it enough? Is it really going to happen? And all of a sudden we see the latest IMF data saying that its economy has grown this year as opposed to shrunk because it's been able to do a lot of this rerouting. And I want to start with oil because I think the story is really interesting and I want our audience to understand kind of the ways in which they're able to kind of circumvent these sanctions and keep that oil machine going, which, as you mentioned, is really driving the economy, even if people say, oh, no, sanctions, price caps. Not true.
Yeah. So what's interesting where energy is concerned is I think there's sort of different phases over last year, right? So from the get-go, and there was what we've called self-sanctioning at the beginning of the war, either stakeholder pressure or other things that said, well, why are we buying Russian oil? Now, of course, sitting here in the United States, the US never really bought much, Russian oil, a little bit here and there, some specific products, but it was a pretty small amount. And other countries like Canada, it was even a tinier amount. But for Europe, they were buying a lot of Russian fuel. And actually, as we speak right now at the beginning of February, they still are buying some Russian fuel, particularly oil products. But we'll come back to that. But from the get-go, if anything, the US Treasury and its allies said, hey guys, wait, we're not sanctioning Russian oil. We're not sanctioning the current production, right? The sanctions were earmarked towards increasing the costs and degrading Russia's future capacity. But they were worried, I think justifiably, but they were worried about the cost to the global economy of a sudden stop of Russian oil and other commodities. And part of this was looking for asymmetric ways to cause more pain to Russia than to countries in this sort of coalition. And of course, Russia is looking for ways to inflict asymmetric pain on its adversaries. So we can come back to sort of who's winning there. maybe it's a stalemate, as and protracted conflict economically, just like it is on the battlefield. I actually would argue that, if anything, it has hurt Russia more than it's hurt the sort of, the global economy. But the point is, it's not easy to put a lot of economic pressure on one of the largest suppliers of natural resources in the world, particularly when its interests are allied with another large supplier of natural resources, Saudi Arabia. So for the first several months of the war, the U.S. Treasury went out of its way to say, guys, this is not sanctioned. There is an exemption. You can continue to buy Russian fuel. And that sort of changed in the middle of the year rhetorically when the Europeans said, hey, let's do an embargo. But they announced it to come into effect 6 months from then. And that is what turned into the oil price cap. So the EU had an embargo on Europeans buying Russian crude oil, but also European ships and insurance companies trading in it. And that got broadened out to the G7. But they said, well, if you pay less than $60, you can still use those services. So again, that was the US Treasury and entities like Germany coming in and saying, wait, we don't want that sudden stop of Russian oil. We want them to get less money for their resources, but we don't want it to completely disappear, because then that might mean the Russians still make a lot of money on the black market and the like. So where we are now is one where, yeah, Russia is making less money on its oil, but it's still making money, a fair amount of it. Russia's own choice, partway through this, in the middle of the year, they decided to sharply reduce natural gas exports. And so you don't supply as much, you don't get paid. So when we look at Russia's budget, we see that revenues have come way down. Expenditures, to the best we can tell, have gone up. But this is still something they can survive, right? They're not thriving, but they're surviving. And Russia entered this war with very low debt levels, especially external debt levels, and domestically a fair amount of savings. They had underinvested for years. And so it gave them more sort of, space to kind of create this sort of war, military, industrial economy. And it's very challenging for the private sector in Russia. But this isn't something where, they're sort of screaming and sort of, running away and saying, well, we must, end this war. Now, of course, we could turn back and say, well, it's illegal and one could end up in prison if you sort of talked about the war. So it makes it challenging in that way. So, but from an energy perspective, the first half of the war, you actually still had a lot of energy revenues, and Russia struggled to import. So the Western countries wouldn't send them items. Even the Chinese were wary. And then you hit the middle of last year and Russia cuts off natural gas, but its imports start to pick up. And that's where this finding additional supplies via Central Asian countries or the Caucasian countries or via Turkey, right? Turkey was one of the first countries to really step up and be an intermediary, and via China. Now, I do think that the quality of those goods, has maybe diminished, but again, it comes back to they're surviving and the like. What we're seeing right now on the energy front that I think is relevant is also that the price cap is structured that, if you want to use Western services, it has to be below a certain price. But if you're willing to use non-Western services, it can be whatever price you want. And the US view at first was, well, but our services, the Western services, are better, right? And it's going to be costly. Who's going to want to use Russian insurance? Who's going to want to use Chinese tankers? And I think what we found is if the price is right, people are willing to use Russian sort of 25-year-old tankers that the Russians bought up from the Greeks, hypothetically. And so that also means that there are Russian interests and Russian and supporters in other countries that are making money, not just on selling the oil, but on contracting the tankers and the insurance. Now there's a big question on the line. What happens if there's an oil spill? What happens if there is an accident? And undoubtedly there will be one at some point. But for me, who's thinking, both about the market impacts, but also likes to look ahead and say, well, how's the balance of power shifting? I think, well, we've taken this market that was highly dominant by, insurance, highly dominated by Britain, for example, and shipping that was highly dominated by Southern European countries, Greece, Cyprus, etc. And suddenly they're new entrants. And that sometimes we can look at it from a political science perspective and say, well, sometimes when you use your leverage, is it there anymore? And that doesn't mean don't use it, but it does mean that there are some of these tipping points. And I think that's something I'm watching on the sort of service side, as well as, of course, what's happening with currency usage. I still think the dollar is very dominant as a saving currency. But, we're starting to see the Russians try to engage in new financing and payment systems. I don't think Russia and Iran clubbing together for the payment system really helps. It helps them, but it doesn't really change the global balance of power. But, there's some of these tipping points that start to open up, and I don't want to overestimate them. I don't want to underestimate them. But I think when we look back, we will see a dynamic where the fact that you had extensive sanctions on Russia, but also export controls and the like on China, both in 2022, this will be an important tipping point. And I think it comes at a time where a lot of countries, especially in the global South, are thinking about what are their own interests. What are the political groupings? Is it regional? Is it minilateral? How do they hedge? This isn't the same non-aligned movement of, many decades ago, but it is one of realignments. And I don't think we know exactly where that's going to shape out.
Well, one of the things that my students are very interested in following, and several things. One is, the fact that policymakers have to reconcile disparate objectives. So on the one hand, you want to starve Russia of the wherewithal to continue its operation in Ukraine. You want to produce pressures that will either force the Kremlin to withdraw or that create significant problems in Russia. But at the same time, you have doorstep considerations around the world of what people are willing to pay for food and fuel and commodities. So you're trying, as you said, to find these measures, which is, we don't have replacements for everything that Russia supplies: natural gas, oil, strategic minerals, food, fertilizer. So some Russian product still has to find a way to market. But the other thing, and you've talked about this with the global South, is the rise of what we might see as these intermediary countries, not just China, but as you mentioned, Turkey, India, which are aligned and partnered with the West, but also are maintaining these kind of conduits to trade and transact with Russia, and to do so in a way that allows for, and Tatiana, going back to your point about your encounter with the Norwegians and others, to allow people in the West in a way to have the sense that they have clean hands, that, we're importing oil or gas or commodities that have come from a Turkish exchange or that have been resold from India. So we're not buying directly from Russia. And at the same time, and Rachel, I think, you and I and others have been looking at these fascinating charts that have been coming out, these end of year charts, and watching that, yes, European direct exports to Russia, particularly of electronics, way down. And then you see this massive spike of European exports to Armenia, to Azerbaijan, to Uzbekistan, to Kazakhstan. And, it's not as if suddenly Kazakhstan, has this insatiable demand for electronics. It's clear And again, there's a bit of that clean hands of, well, once we sell it to Kazakhstan, if it gets resold to Russia, that's not, we're abiding by sanctions. Do you see this as, these questions of the intermediaries, these middle powers, sort of sitting at the nexus between the Western, that are integrated in the Western world, Turkey certainly as a member of NATO, but also saying, as you said, it's in our interests to facilitate trade with Russia. And, and if Russia has to discount sales to us, and then we get to increase the price to resell to Italy or, someone else, why wouldn't they? And is that going to be the next challenge of how we're going to go to a Turkey or an India and really say, we'd like you to do less of this facilitation?
Yeah. And I think it's been a challenge going on. I mean, it comes in waves, right? Because what happens is loopholes sort of close off and then they reopen. I mean, I think there's been a concern about, what happens, do you restrict and say, okay, well, you can't sell more fill in the blank refrigerators to Kazakhstan than you did the last year. And actually I'm conscious of sort of the history here, right? This is not the first time this has been an issue. Nick Mulder's great book that came out last year, The Economic Weapon, talks about the ways in which the combined Franco-British efforts in the First World War sort of tried to sort of set targets for neutral countries. Right. And then the question mark is, where do you set it? What happens if there's a one-off, and what happens, which products? Like maybe refrigerators is an easier thing to do. In those cases in the First World War, sometimes it was about energy or food products or the like, things that of course we're generally exempting from sanctions now for good reason. But how do you assess for kind of what's the actual demand of neutral countries? And how do you do that? So I think if I look at it, yes, so it is a big issue. I think it's complicated by a couple factors. One is that the US, and more broadly, the sort of, coalition of sanctioning countries is going to India or Turkey and saying, okay, there's certain things you can buy from Russia at certain prices. And there's certain other things we really wish you wouldn't buy from Russia or supply to them. And there are certain things that they're actually technology export controls that the US and to a lesser extent its allies are sort of really trying to have enforcement actions on. But some of the challenge is that in addressing the doorstep issues that you guys do such a great job articulating, especially around sort of food and fuel sort of writ large, and trying to keep those flowing. And there can be then a mixed message of, okay, well, if we can buy those things from Russia, how do we avoid having a big external surplus or deficit with Russia, which is an issue for Turkey, and it's an issue for India, China as well, but in a different way. So some of it is that how much can you target and reshape that trade? Because just as Russia is kind of creating new routing, the US is using tools that we have not used before. This price cap is a very new tool. The kind of embargo, this weaponization of insurance dominance is also, and it's an element, and sort of, Newman and Farrell, there's sort of work on weaponized interdependence and finding those choke points that someone can control, I think really is a good one to look back. And it's a good one to look back and say, well, what happens if you try to create a choke point and you don't actually control that choke point? And that's where I think, or as a one country, you don't control that choke point. And maybe that's where some of the challenges with the semiconductor export controls in China come into play. Though I think the US has done an effort after the fact to kind of build out that coalition. We'll see what the sort of lessons learned from that are. But back to Russia. So I think there's that element. The other one that I think the US Treasury is focused on is, instead of just saying to Kazakhstan, okay, well, don't sell more than that, because some of it's state capacity to monitor and control the borders. at a time when these countries have also had a lot of Russians fleeing mobilization come into their countries, which of course has boosted, their domestic demand. It's put pressure on housing and food. Unsurprisingly, growth is stronger in those countries because suddenly their population is bigger, and in a way that we don't count very well as macroeconomists. But the way the U.S. government and allies have tackled this is trying to restrict some of the alternate payment systems. So there was a window earlier in the year where some of Russia's neighbors and friendly countries were starting to maybe align with Russia's MIR system, their domestic payment system that helped them kick Visa and MasterCard out of the country for domestic payments. And it did connect into a few neighboring countries, places like Turkey, places like Kazakhstan. There was a trial to do it in India. And so what happened was, late in the summer, I believe it was, the U.S. Treasury put some of the Russians involved in running these networks on the sanctions list. And so they didn't sanction the system exactly, but they basically said, and then went to Turkish banks and other banks and said, this person's on the sanctions list. I really, and therefore the network, I think there's a lot of risk to doing business there. And sure enough, the sort of flows trickle down. Now, I go back to the point, which is, you close one loophole, a new one opens up. It's a game of whack-a-mole to some extent. Sanctions enforcement is like that. And Tatiana, you mentioned the sort of IMF data and so on. My work on sanctions in Russia and Iran and elsewhere sort of tells me the story that in the absence of escalating sort of new measures, countries and markets adjust, right? So you find loopholes, you find ways, especially when there is not a unity from all trading partners around isolating the country. Now, I mean, you could argue, and here clearly that's not the case. Now, I think the Chinese are picking and choosing what areas they trade with Russia. I do think that unlike some US worries, China has not been supplying a lot of military, sort of hasn't been directly supporting the military. Of course, they're selling them electronics that then the Russian military can repurpose. So, I mean, maybe I'm drawing too fine a line there. But yeah, this is clearly an element where these loopholes, have, materialized. And it does mean that even though sanctions are having an effect, some of that effect is in centralizing and consolidating power within Russia. So it's becoming smaller, but also more centralized, more military and government led. But at the same time, these loopholes are sort of opening up. And I think there are a lot of countries that are looking out for like, what's the arbitrage here? First of all, because they don't want to suddenly turn around and say, well, the US, the price cap worked really well, maybe we apply it to another country, right? Or a different industry. I know there's talk about, is that something that could be done with certain other minerals? I think critical minerals, for example, is a tricky one because the US and allies don't dominate that sector. So I think it'd be a dangerous one to sort of throw out in that way. But I think there's that fear of could they be on the receiving end? There is also, sort of an element of countries looking around and saying, well, what's in our national interest? And so if you're the UAE or Saudi Arabia, you might say, well, hey, we could get cheap crude oil that we can, that can serve our domestic market, and then we can sell our own crude oil at a higher price, right? That arbitrage looks quite attractive. Maybe there's some other elements here. And so I think the net result is one where, as you said, Nick, that how do you balance those different policy objectives and the timelines as well, right? There's a debate going on right now. And maybe it's been from February 20th. To what extent do you sort of do not maximum pressure, but a big bang of sanctions that really imposes costs? And of course, that's going to impose costs on the global economy as well, right? Because Russia is a major supplier, in the hopes of kind of bringing the war to a close more quickly So you incur that pain in the short term, you know, versus kind of an economic sort of war of attrition. I think the dynamics is always, I mean, I probably come down to, of course, the war of attrition is not a good outcome. But the challenge is also, has always, with sanctions, has always been one of the things of buying time for the military assistance, for the other support to sort of, you know, have, you know, sort of have effect.
I'd like to kind of stay on this idea of choices and you know, arbitrage and deciding, and it's not just at the government level. And I think I want to kind of go down to
Sure.
At the company level. What we're seeing, or the data that's come up too, is that, you know, in the end, maybe companies, some companies said, okay, we're going to shut down our subsidiaries. But then if you look at the overall number, the percentage is really low. You know, not every company pulled out. Some companies are pulling accounting tricks by writing off the asset, but then, you know, when you're waiting it out, to your point, waiting it out, and then if things change, and then all of a sudden they'll, you know, kind of go back in with, you know, very little damage to, you know, to their, you know, accounting overall. And I think that's important to understand, because in the beginning of this second, you know, invasion, there was this, you know, don't buy Russian caviar, no, you know, no Russian this, no Russian that. And I am not hearing the same right now, and on a lower level. And I think, you know, companies, I don't think are, you know, anecdotally aren't feeling that pressure. And I think it's from the data, it looks like they're just waiting out this, you know, well, it might be over soon, and then we could just restart our operations. Because really, you know, 100% of companies of US and European who said they would pull out have not.
Yeah. So I think we have to, without being apologist or anything like that, which I know is sounding like I was about to be, I understand kind of the different subsets of the companies who stayed, right? And also, this is the kind of thing where sometimes sitting in the US, it's how do you play through what we do or what allies do, what the response is from Russia or from the sort of target. And I know, and it you know, it was perhaps self-serving, but for some companies, they say, well, if we pull out and we just leave, we are handing over equipment and other assets and people to the Russians. And so the net result of our leaving and abandoning might, you know, and that's where I think different sectors create different issues. And of course, the Russians have zero interest in making it easier to repatriate equipment and money and the like. So that's one, you know, sort of issue. So I think it was a lot easier for, say you were a company that had a franchise, you know, say a high level, you know, sort of a Zara or a sort of a retail company, like it's a lot easier for them to pull out than, you know, say you're a capital intensive oil service company. That doesn't mean that they haven't sort of left. Now, sometimes, as you say, there's an accounting trick of maybe they sold to, you know, local partner or something like that. You know, what do you do if the asset you had in country was intellectual property that had been developed from people working sort of over time, you know, and coming at a time where for a lot of places, it wasn't easy for sort of Russians to leave. I mean, you know, I've just talked about people fleeing across the border, but across Europe, no longer sort of issuing visas to sort of many Russians and so on. So I do think that there are sort of challenges, especially for companies that are like, look, you know, we don't want to just abandon our Russian staff. So I do think, again, without it sort of saying, well, you know, of course one shouldn't leave, you know, when you get down to the nuts and bolts, there's some complications. I think then the other challenge that comes to play goes back to this whole, what happens when the US and allies are trying to pick and choose which trade with Russia can go ahead. So you actually needed a circumstance where some businesses, you know, continue, especially banks, continue to have certain levels of operation there. Or, you know, what happened? I've talked to some companies who say, well, our lawyers all picked up and left and moved to Dubai. And this is a really, I mean, it's always been a murky legal situation in Russia with potentially arbitrary application of rules. but at a time of, what does the exit look like? So there can be waves of unintended consequences. But you're right. I think there's a lot of entities that are waiting and seeing, and a lot that are like, well, we want to leave, but we have money in the bank. We want to take that with us. And so and some of them maybe want that money and also have written down. But yeah, I mean, I saw, and I haven't looked at it in detail, but the new Yale School of Management, Kiev School of Economics has just done an update kind of on where the companies are. And so the considerations I'm talking about are what I hear from Western companies. Some of those from emerging market economies are even more likely to kind of stay put or continue. What I haven't seen though are sort of major new investments from emerging market, economies and countries. So some of them might well have, say there was a Turkish company partner with a US company, maybe there's been a little bit of selling out to that partner or to the Russian partner, but there hasn't been a lot of new investment. And that's rational, right? For all the reasons we've talked about, just from an economic perspective, irrespective of the bigger moral sort of imperative. And sort of, and the like. I do think some of it's going to depend a lot on, on sectors and the like. But yeah, I mean, people have maybe, I think some companies have held on sort of too much. But it is that trade-off of, at the end of the day, in leaving, do you, transfer your assets to the Russian military machine, but saying you're complicit with implementing mobilization and all sorts of things. And those trade-offs are difficult for companies. And I think some of them, have scaled down to very small operations and are just trying to figure out how to do the least damage. And some are sort of probably just sort of, waiting around. I mean, I do think there's an interesting question. We're far from a point where we can start to think in a realistic manner about what sort of sanctions lifting and the like would look like. Though I always think, especially with an analyst hat on, that a tool is most effective if you think about what reversing it might look like. So making sure you have the ability to do that. And one thing that I think is going to be interesting to watch, we've seen this trend towards asset seizure and forfeiture. I mean, it hasn't happened yet, but a lot of countries in the sanctioning coalition, Canada first, sort of followed by the US, maybe Europe's coming, are sort of changing their legal systems to allow for frozen assets to be seized and go towards Ukraine. And that, I think, there's a lot of resonance. So it checks a whole bunch of boxes, right? It's, how do you pay for reconstruction? Well, Russians ought to pay for sort of part of that. It allows them to sort of send a message that some of these oligarch assets were ill-gotten illicit gains, right? And so sending that message. And then, of course, it might be a dynamic, though, of, well, if the assets are seized and forfeited, there definitely can't be, sort of sanctions relief down the line. And so I think there's a lot of these different things in play. And from our perspective, thinking about not only what happens with Russia, but what messages are being taken away from other countries, I think it raises interesting questions about, both with how we deal with sort of illicit, the proceeds of kleptocracy, something I know you guys have talked a lot about and done a lot to sort of bring to the fore, but also how does sort of foreign investment, evolve? And I think especially sort of certain questions vis-a-vis what the structures are in China. And so a lot of these are things where I can see things changing and we don't know exactly how they're going to change.
Well, we are going to keep looking for changes and hope to have you back to help explain it and really bring awareness to, these reroutings and these loopholes, because that's important. We can't just say, oh yeah, we're done now, and we're just fighting the war. And I think that's really kind of an important discussion to have as we're getting more of this data in. So thank you so much for joining us today and explaining all this.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.